friendship with you and other people like you in college made me think critically about this Jesus fella. And I said, I either got to follow him fully or abandon him. But this kind of middle way, middle path nonsense doesn't make sense. As the good book says in Revelation, he'll spit me out if that's the case. And so I was comfortable just studying the word randomly with my friends and arguing over baby baptism and other strange doctrinal differences between Protestants and Orthodox and other things, even while I was not going to the Orthodox church. But eventually I did my own kind of personal survey of church history. And when I felt comfortable, not just because I was baptized, but because I thought there was some historic truth in the Oriental Orthodox tradition, I decided to go back to church. Again, y'all like Ice Cube told me to go to church. I did. I started pouring holy water. I can't sing. They put me in the choir and then started having me teach. And eventually in 2015, they ordained me a deacon, which is the smallest of the high orders under priest and bishop, as you know. It's the same in the Catholic tradition as the Orthodox. And I've been serving now, closing in on a decade.
Hello and welcome to the Black Catholic Messenger Show, where we keep it Black and we keep it Catholic. I'm Nate Tenor Williams, and this is our guest today,
Deacon Henok Elias.
Thank you, Deacon. And we are very excited to have you on the show today. We've been planning this for a really, really long time, and I'm glad to finally have you on the show. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good, and just so your audience members know that I can't say that I am Black and proud, but I am a lowercase c Catholic. We could explain that as we go, not a capital C Catholic or member of the RCC or any affiliate uniate churches. I come from the Orient or the Orthodox Church, however you want to call it.
Can you be more specific? Also, that's crazy that you said uniate, because that's just a crazy word.
Is that word problematic? I hear some people saying it, but I never really heard why. I also hear people say Eastern rites, but
I heard some people say uniate is problematic because it was used way back in the day to derisively refer to Eastern Catholic churches as like wannabe Orthodox and halfway Catholic.
I mean, it sounds pretty accurate. I don't know where the derogatory part is, but I have friends. I have friends who are of that persuasion, and maybe they can elaborate for me.
Now that I think about it, there are a lot of who would fall into that category. However, people would use that word in general to refer to the fact that Eastern Catholic churches exist in the first place.
I was going to say that the during the current Pope Leo's early part of his reign, he had this message. I've been following the Vatican news a lot. It's been very interesting, and the website got updated. It's very interesting stuff. I follow the Instagram account that teaches you how to sing in Latin, certain things. Yes. And one of the first kind of statements that I think is one of his new emphases, and you could correct me on that, is he called it the Jubilee of the Oriental Churches. And what he meant by that was not, to your earlier question, my specific communion, which begins in Alexandria, Egypt, and Antioch of Greater Syria, which is to say the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which includes the Eritreans. And then much later, we grafted in the so-called Indian Orthodox. They go by other names as well. The St. Thomas Christians. They're also, their endonym is the Malankara. And then sometimes people call them Malabar because of the geographic area in which they're in southwest India is called the Malabar Coast, or their current state in the government of India is called Kerala. So they have all these names, Kerala Christians, and then sometimes people differentiate between the various groups who are East and West Syriac and who are either Catholic or Orthodox, or some of them even Anglican or Protestant. So there are a lot of kind of divisions within them. But I would say their original RITE, was East Syriac, what some people call Nestorian, but linguistically is East Syriac. And so because of that affinity with the West Syriac Orthodox who are in my communion, they were able to connect, or you could say reconnect, with our part of Christendom. And our part of Christendom in the West in English is often called the Oriental Orthodox Church,
Mm-hmm.
to distinguish from the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is a misnomer because Oriental and Eastern mean the same thing, like Western and Occidental. You guys have your own arguments of ad Occidentum, right, or ad Orientum. But the
Yes.
Pope Leo had an address called Jubilee to the Oriental Churches, and he did not mean my peoples,
Right.
but he meant the adjacent peoples to me who have the same Ge'ez, or classical Ethiopic liturgical rite, which is a subsection of the Alexandrian rite that could be practiced and have a new missal that was released, and there's a video of it. I think they were celebrating at the Vatican, a new Roman approved missal for the Catholics under the Ge'ez rite. But there's a Ge'ez rite which is Catholic and a Ge'ez rite which is Orthodox.
So clearly we can see that you're very knowledgeable about these things.
Yeah, about the family of Christians.
I was in Rome for the Jubilee of the Oriental churches. I wasn't there for that reason, but it just so happened to take place right after Pope Leo was elected. So I had come there to attend the funeral of Pope Francis, and then for the conclave, and then the Jubilee of the Oriental churches happened. But yeah, Oriental churches is one way they refer to the Eastern Catholic churches, and I think the Vatican department for the Eastern Catholic churches is still called the Dicastery for the Oriental churches, or something like that. I may be wrong about that, but
I saw that name. I think you're right, and that's probably because it's an easier translation when you're going from probably Italian and Latin. Probably the word Oriental is like in sound approximate to whatever they're using in Italian and in Latin.
Interesting. You're a linguistics guy as well. I forget about this.
You too. You've studied some languages.
But I don't know any languages, so there's a difference. But Hano, tell us about your background. Where do you come from, and what do you do?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I'm the product of two Ethiopian immigrants who came in the early 1970s. At that time, Ethiopia was an Orthodox Christian theocracy, a monarchy. And in that time period, my parents' original plan, like the generation before them, because the kind of modern education system was not as advanced in Ethiopia as it was in Europe and in the United States, was to go abroad for 4 years for their college education after having completed high school locally, and then to return to Ethiopia using their education for the purposes of their country. They got stuck in a compulsory brain drain of sorts because a year after they moved to the United States, a communist revolution took place in Ethiopia, as it did in many parts of the world.
The Derg?
The Derg, yeah. It's called the Derg, which in Ge'ez or classical Ethiopic means committee, right? So if anyone knows about committees and the way decision making is made through unanimity on committees, whether real or conjured unanimity, it's like rule by committee. But if you ever read George Orwell's Animal Farm, that plays its role almost every time. But it was on paper a Marxist-Leninist regime, and it had connections to Cuba and to Russia during that time in the 70s and 80s. And so my dad ended up not going back at all throughout that time. My mom went back a couple times to visit her parents, but that's kind of like the context in which I grew up in Los Angeles. A couple decades after they were stranded in Los Angeles, my mom went to DC first and then LA. But I grew up in that context of two Ethiopian immigrants who had grown up basically in a feudal society that was defeudalizing. And instead of liberalization to liberalism, it liberalized to communism. And it later had something approaching neoliberalism and what they call the federal democracy. But I grew up in that environment in LA in the 90s, in the time of the LA riots and a lot of other things that were going on in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood at first. And I went to public school for a little bit, but I also went to a Montessori as a young kid and started going to more predominantly white institutions. The latter of which is where I met you in our collegiate education in Pepperdine.
Baby.
Yeah, go Waves. Let's go Waves. AOA, as they say.
I almost made our old hand sign for the Waves, but I've heard that we no longer can do that.
Yeah, we can. It's okay if they're still allowed to have Poseidon or whatever sea god they have on those old vans. I don't know if they still rock those vans over there at that Christian university. But if they're allowed to have the god of the sea in the Roman and Greek tradition at a Protestant American school, then we can make old signs. But yeah, I grew up in that context in a very progressive, liberal environment. And I'd say Pepperdine was a formative moment. Meeting you, actually, and the friends and the friend group and the group chats we still have led to critical thinking that got me to go back to church. You probably singularly, but then also in our friend group, all of you were telling me I needed to go to church because my parents never went to church. They baptized us. They went through all the rituals of Epiphany and Christmas and Easter and big holidays, but they were not regular Sunday Christians. And there certainly was no regular prayer in our house. We had prayer maybe 2 or 3 times a year because older uncles and aunts would be there and you couldn't do anything otherwise. I personally believe, my parents would dispute this, that mine and my 2 younger sisters' baptisms were also compelled by our grandmothers and great aunties who were alive. I really do believe that. And so, they were strong enough to not go to church on Sundays, but not strong enough to not baptize us and not do those things. So it made us cradle Orthodox. So I was always a kind of nominal Christian, but friendship with you and other people like you in college made me think critically about this Jesus fella. And I said, I either got to follow him fully or abandon him. But this kind of middle path nonsense doesn't make sense. As the good book says in Revelation, he'll spit me out if that's the case. And so I was comfortable just studying the word randomly with my friends and arguing over baby baptism and other strange doctrinal differences between Protestants and Orthodox and other things, even while I was not going to the Orthodox church. But eventually I did my own kind of personal survey of church history. And when I felt comfortable, not just because I was baptized, but because I thought there was some historic truth in the Oriental Orthodox tradition, I decided to go back to church. Again, y'all like Ice Cube told me to go to church. I did. I started pouring holy water. I can't sing. They put me in the choir and then started having me teach. And eventually in 2015, they ordained me a deacon, which is the smallest of the high orders under priest and bishop, as you know. It's the same in the Catholic tradition as the Orthodox. And I've been serving now closing in on a decade in that capacity, in regular liturgical, matrimonial, and funerary and baptismal services in the Orthodox Church, mostly in the Ethiopian tradition, but occasionally I do visit the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Coptic Orthodox Church. I visited an Indian Orthodox once. I haven't really visited an Armenian church, so that's the only one on my list between our communion that I haven't visited.
Interesting. Wow. Man, that's beautiful. That story of faith. And yeah, man, I remember having those debates when I was still on the other side, when I was still a Protestant, and I knew the Bible back and forth, and I thought that I could argue well. Looking back now, I'm like, man, but still, God works in mysterious ways that debating with a bunch of Protestants could bring an Orthodox man back into his church.
Yeah, well, I was nominal. So the thing that you guys had is that you all were attached to traditions, right? The homie Armani is Church of Christ. Kenny, I think, is a Baptist or something.
I believe so.
You had both Reformed and Anabaptist inclinations, right?
A bunch of other denominations in the past.
Yeah. So I had a suite mate who was Catholic, actually from Minnesota. And so even at that time when you and I were talking, he'd invite me randomly. And when he'd invite me randomly, I never said no to church. I was always open to God. And so when Protestant missionaries said, let's go to Honduras, I went to Honduras for a week and tried to practice my Spanish as much as possible while doing like a mission work in the Protestant tradition. When my Catholic friend said, let's go to the Catholic church, I'd visit. You know, some of the Ethiopians that were more serious about their Christianity happened to be Pentecostals at our school. And so the Ethiopian Pentecostals invite me to go to some Pentecostal service. I was at that time visiting the Pentecostal church, and I got to see that one too.
Wow.
So yeah, I kind of got a taste and flavor of the different parts of Christendom while there.
But you found out that Ethiopian Orthodox was your home.
Yes, you know, I don't want to dive into the Christology and bore your audience. The Christology was one thing.
Dive into whatever you would like to dive into.
The other thing was the unity. You know, there's this line in the Proverbs about how there are 6 things which the Lord hates, but the 7th thing his soul abominates or really hates and abhors. And that's the people who sow seeds of division in the church. And so people who nitpick and find the smallest reasons to create an entire denomination, right? Not to poke too much fun, but the church of the school that we attended claimed to be the church of 33 AD. Even when I wasn't going to church, that used to crack me up. And I said, you know, you do the most cursory church history glance, and you see they come out of the revivalist Alexander Campbell movement in America in the 1800s, right? Not 33 AD. And one of the kind of points, although there are different opinions of their denomination, is that they were a cappella. By the way, I liked that about them. I don't hold to that dogmatically. I don't think like God hates instruments, but I do think God has a preference for a cappella because it's the instrument that he made rather than the instrument that we make. And I think as humans, ever since Adam and Eve try to cover themselves up with the garden's tools and materials, we always kind of fancy these things that we make, these structures we make, as opposed to what God makes. And so I think they do even have a strong argument, but you can't make a whole denomination based off of that. And what I found in what I prefer to call my communion the Afro-Asiatic communion, because it's about the languages. Coptic is in the Afro-Asiatic language family, and so is Syriac. And those were our first 2 members. And in general, our communities are the indigenous and native Christians of Africa and Asia, of mostly West Asia, but also South Asia, and then North Africa and the Horn of Africa. So in that group, I saw a lack of schism going back to the year 451 AD. There's some time where there were some communications after 451 AD for a couple of centuries. And so it's not a hard and fast date, but it was at that date where the original sees, SEES, or thrones of apostolic activity in what we call Christianity or Christendom today, were in 3 places. They were in Antioch and Alexandria and Rome. Constantinople was added later for political reasons and because it was considered the new Rome, but it wasn't in the original church. It was Rome, which are you all, and Alexandria and Antioch. And so Alexandria and Antioch and Rome decided to split ways from each other over a disagreement about how to express the full humanity and divinity of Christ. Today, people have come up with a lot of shared statements, and some people attribute it to linguistic arguments or like they try to explain it away in terms of geopolitics, and there's some stuff to that. But I tend personally to lean on the side that tried not to change the verbiage, right? That's one of the things about Orthodoxy is it kind of it's almost like a museum. It shouldn't be a museum. It should be a living being as a church, as the body of Christ. But it tries to preserve that snapshot of what was available in the early church. And incredibly, since that time, I always highlight and praise the Roman Church, especially figures like the recently reposed in the Lord Pope Francis, for extending ecumenical efforts by
Yes.
recognizing saints across the ages. The two that I point to during his time as Pope, one in 2015, and the actor who plays Jesus on The Chosen is a Catholic, although he grew up Greek Orthodox, of Egyptian persuasion. And so he had a little bit of heart towards this. He made a film that I reviewed on my blog on the Oxfam Review of Books called The 21, about these 21 Egyptian or Coptic Orthodox martyrs in Libya to Daesh or to ISIS. And Pope Francis recognized them and immediately put them in the Roman martyrology. And then the second one, who he went so far as to make a doctor of the church, which you can tell me more about. Like, it's not a normal saint. A doctor is very high, is Saint Gregory of Narek, who comes, I think, in the 900s or so, or the 9th century or the 8th century. I'm not sure the exact date, but centuries after Chalcedon in 451, centuries after our formal split. So he declared one guy centuries after our split a doctor of the church. That's the Armenian Saint Gregory of Narek. And then he included 21. One of those 21 actually is not Egyptian, is ethnically Ghanaian. And it's not clear. Some people say he was Catholic. Some people say he was Muslim. But in the telling of the various telling of the stories, when ISIS was about to behead or shoot or however they put to death these new martyrs, he said, like the book of Ruth, whatever their God is, that's my God. And so there's some telling of the story where he had kind of a chance to escape, or at least a chance to deny Christ on camera.
Yeah.
And him and every single one of them refused to do so. And so instead they shot this like 30-minute propaganda video where they put all those people in the Libyan desert to death. And Pope Francis recognized them, while there were certain American Protestant Christians saying, oh, those boys ain't saved.
Gotta love America. Gotta love Protestantism. I also think it's really important that Pope Francis did that, because you have to be able to recognize, despite all the things that have happened in the past between the churches, you have to be able to recognize holiness and martyrdom across the Christian spectrum, because that in some ways is what continued to unite us, and always has. You know, even when they would split, there were still outside parties who were persecuting Christians. It didn't matter what church you were in. So yeah, recognizing that unity and the fact that we all basically believe in the same thing, even about Christ, I would say, is important. I know we split over Christ or things we say about Christ, but even since then we've discovered that not all of the polemics were quite accurate.
Yeah, and I'd love to one day like meticulously get through the catechism. I don't know if they teach about Miaphysite Christology, which is our Christology in the catechism. And this is it. I don't want to say it's not worthwhile. And there are people online, people could look up. Subdeacon Daniel Kakish from the Syriac Orthodox Church. There's a guy, Egan, very young guy, runs an account called Apostolic Orthodoxy. And they speak at length online and multiple platforms, but especially YouTube, about the issue of Christology and talking about it and defending it and saying the real differences about the expressions thereof. But yeah, the blood of the martyrs has to be something that unites us. And a big figure in our church is the criminal who was crucified on the right hand of Jesus. And in fact, I've seen this connection with the Chaldean Catholics, who are East Syriac, but they're Catholic.
Yeah.
They share this. They have this play called Gayasa, which is how they refer to the criminal on the right hand of Jesus. And we have the exact same play in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And so there's a strong connection because there's Semitic languages between Semitic-speaking Christianity in the Syriac tradition, which is also shared, of course, by the Maronites, and the Ethiopian Orthodox, who have Ge'ez. And Ge'ez and Syriac are very close languages to each other and to Hebrew and Arabic. But in that emphasis, we always remember that, like, even within our catechisms, when we talk about all the things that you need to be baptized and all the specifications, you have people arguing online, do you sprinkle or do you fully immerse? You have to ask yourself, what about the thief or the criminal who was on the right hand of Jesus? And he certainly didn't go through any of that rigmarole, but he went through what some fathers of the church call a sort of baptism by blood.
Yeah.
And so to your point, like that has to unite us, especially when the church is facing persecution, as you see in the, I think, most extreme in the Church of the Middle East, right? I've been following very closely. I believe he's Cardinal Pizzaballa, right? In Gaza and in elsewhere, right? But even in like ISIS controlled areas, as I was talking about earlier, in addition to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And then when you look at just earlier today, I was looking at some imagery of a funeral of a Catholic priest in China. And when you study how the Chinese Communist Party has very like specific metrics by which they allow denominations to exist, by which they allow translations. I think they have their own CCP translation of scripture. I've heard it. I don't know if it's true. I have to verify it, and I don't know Chinese. That, for example, they even change things like in John 8 to where like the stoning of the adulteress is like approved, you know, as a justification for the death penalty. Like there are certain things where in the United States we're not experiencing the level of persecution they're experiencing in the Middle East and in China. And so especially I'd say the more persecuted your tradition is, the more the kind of if we could call them extracurriculars or particulars start to seem not important, but less important in priorities.
Absolutely. I actually just got finished taking a master's course on Christology at my school in New Orleans, Xavier University of Louisiana. And it was fascinating to go back through all those controversies related to Christology and kind of just see how, I don't want to say minor, but like these are not things we can really even conceive of disagreeing about to that level today. It was like that was, for whatever reason, so charged at that time that it was worth splitting over. But today, I don't think we could conceive of such a thing because, yeah, there's bigger fish to fry, like the fact that Christians are being slaughtered all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, I forget. I'm sorry, I can't cite properly. If I had the time, I could. But Saint Ignatius of Antioch was a mutual saint, way before the schism, right? I think he's a pre-Nicene father. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who, by the way, sometimes when Catholics say Saint Ignatius, I get confused and think they're talking about him, but they're usually talking about Saint Ignatius of Loyola.
The Jesuit.
Yeah, exactly. But Saint Ignatius of Antioch is, I don't know, maybe I don't know the history of the Jesuits that well, but it's probably where Saint Ignatius of Loyola gets his name, because he's way like 1,000 years his predecessor. But
Yeah.
Saint Ignatius of Antioch has this thing about the Eucharist, and he talks about like what would it take for you basically to break communion with other Christians. And like you said, for me, and I'm not a priest, I'm just a deacon, right? So I'm a helper. I'm not the main one in charge, but you know, if they ever did do that, like I'd push and say and get them to think about Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who says like, be very certain if you're going to break communion with someone, like you said, be very certain of how important the matter is, and really make sure you're standing on solid ground, because the breaking of the Eucharist, or like not having the Eucharist with someone, is very serious. A lot of people, I think, they don't take the severity of it as well, but if you take the gospel at its word, it's a death sentence of sorts to break communion with somebody, right? Is you're saying they're no longer accessing life. So it's a very serious matter that people shouldn't take lightly. And even if they do decide that it is the correct course of action, it's not something that people should be glib about, you know, the way people are online.
To say the least. And online is where we are at our glibbest. Unfortunately, especially among Christians, but that's another story. One thing I want you to explain is how does the diaconate work in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church? I know one difference between our traditions is that we have an age minimum So you kind of have to be an older man. I think it can be as young as like mid to late 30s, but I think even that's an exception. So how does it work in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church? Because I understand it's much younger. People become deacons much younger.
Yeah, this is great. So I talk about this actually a lot with my friend Subdeacon Daniel Kakish, because we have, as I said, a wide communion. And the thing is, we're a lot less centralized than Rome. And so because of that, we have a lot of decentralized practices, so that even our canon of scripture differs within our communion. For example, the Syriac Orthodox Church has a 22-book New Testament canon, and Ethiopian has at least a 27-book one, which is the standard. And sometimes people like to add a little bit more. Some of the early apostolic fathers and writings like that, things like the Shepherd or Hermas. I bring that as a way of analogy to say that we have a kind of de jure and a de facto practice of the diaconate. So de jure, or on paper, like, we have whatever it is that the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Syriac Orthodox Church has. Because while we were very independent, especially because Ethiopia, and this is a very important thing, I think, for your audience to understand, Ethiopia was outside of the purview of the Roman Empire. Most of Christianity, and I would say pretty much the exclusive Christianity that most Westerners understand, was all in the purview of Christianity. The East Syriac, whom we mentioned, which was some pejoratively called the Nestorians, who include, for example, the Church of India, which was later, in later centuries, like very later, grafted into the Oriental or Afro-Asiatic communion. Like, those people were far outside of the Roman Empire. They were in the Persian Empire, or later like a Mughal Empire, or like Mongol territory. And in fact, this East Syriac got to the court of the Khans and even to China, right? So that's way outside of the Roman Empire. And a lot of these early canons in the church, they come through the kind of the order and the rigor that is associated with Roman law, whether we're talking about the western part of the empire or the eastern part of the empire. The Coptic Orthodox Church and the Syriac Orthodox Church, although they were, especially at Chalcedon, against the emperor, especially the Emperor Justinian, who comes later, but especially because they began to position themselves as a sort of anti-imperial church, like, they had a different identity, but they maintained, I'd say, a similar, on paper, diaconate order. But then the Ethiopian church was managed by Coptic bishops until the mid part of the 20th century. And so on paper and in our liturgy every week, we pray for the various ranks of the deacon. The earliest rank of the deacon is called chanter. And pretty much any like little boy could become a chanter. And I could be wrong, but I think some girls are allowed to be. I could be wrong on that point. And that's the same. And this is especially in the Coptic Orthodox and the Syriac Orthodox tradition. And then the next stage is called reader. And usually to be a reader, you should, be able to read, which means to read out loud, not by yourself privately, but before the great congregation. And so you're reading from the lectionary. And that's typically a teenager. In the Coptic Orthodox documents in the West, they typically say about a 16-year-old. And then the idea is that the next rank of the diaconate is called subdeacon. And basically, when you're an adult, and the practice in the United States is usually around 21 years old, you're a subdeacon. And at that stage, you need to make a decision about whether you're going to be chaste or whether you're going to be married. And this is a big point where we differ, especially from the Roman part of the Catholic Church. We're allowed to have married priests, but as the Eastern Catholics are allowed, and maybe one day African Americans will be allowed. But the subdeacon, who's in his early 20s, needs to decide whether he's going to become, and certainly by this point there are no women, needs to determine whether he's going to be married or chaste. And if he's made that decision, then he could move on to the next rank, which is full deacon. And full deacon is often treated as a stepping stone to the priesthood. And so people sometimes are there for 6 months or a year, and then they move on to the priesthood. But there are some like 50 and 60-year-old deacons who remain, and there are very, very, very few full deacons who remain in that position because a lot of people haven't made that marriage choice yet, or they have made that choice and they've moved on to the priesthood. So that's how it is in the Coptic and the Orthodox and the Syriac Orthodox. In the Ethiopian Orthodox, on paper, because of that, it says you can't be a full deacon unless you're married and 25 years old, which seems to match the passage from scripture that you find in 1 Timothy chapter 3, which also, by the way, speaks of bishops. And so we see kind of the practice of our church conflicting with scripture because they made this decision at some point in church history. Even in scripture, you see this dynamic where Peter, all right, with the keys to the kingdom, is married, whereas Paul's not. What'd you say?
Say that again. Peter had what?
Peter is married, but Paul is not.
No, he said he had the keys to the kingdom. I just wanted to
Oh,
for my listeners.
yes. And of course, in our tradition, we believe that the Petrine seat is Antioch. It's very interesting. When I was listening to Pope Leo in his first speech, actually, he mentioned, and I didn't notice, I think it was the, you correct me on the Latin, it was the et urbi, it was like to the city.
The ubi et urbi, something like that.
Yeah,
like,
it's like to the city and to the world. I remember that, to the city and to the world. He mentioned both St. Peter and St. Paul. And I think it's very important. And a lot of the Catholic Brodies don't mention St. Paul, but he did. The Pope did. And I listened to him when he said that. And he said Saints Peter and Paul. And we just celebrated that about a week ago in my tradition. I know it's June 29th in the new calendar. In the old calendar, it's July 12th. It's actually the same date, but it's just a calendar difference of scientific calculation. But I think it's important because in our tradition, we view the kind of beginning apostolic activity in Antioch as having the authority of Peter and Paul, and not just one of them. And then, of course, both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome, and that's undeniable. But that's why there were the Christian sees. And then Alexandria receives its apostolic succession from Mark, who, if you read scripture and church history carefully, was a disciple first of Peter and then of Paul. And so even Alexandria is also Petrine and Pauline via Mark, who was a student of both. And that's kind of the ha-ha rah-rah that we give.
And St. Paul writes about Peter having a wife, right?
Yes, exactly. And so this is a thing that's in scripture, and then church history determines to change it. And so for us, you can't be a married bishop. But obviously at one point in church history you could, but you can be a married priest. And so you make that decision. And in the Ethiopian church, I say that because every liturgy we pray for all of these ranks. But in fact, de facto, when you look at the situation, you have 8 and 10-year-old boys who are basically made full deacons. And then later in their 20s or 30s, they make that decision about whether to be married or chaste before they move on to priesthood. But in the Coptic Orthodox and Syriac Orthodox, they're usually supposed to make that between subdeacon and deacon. But because we kind of blended all the ranks into a melting pot where they're just full deacon at 8 or 10, we skipped that. And the reason is some argue, the conspiracy theorists about how Michael Jackson got his great voice. All right, we'll not get into it, but it might be similar to what people say in church history about origin. For those who know, they know. But the reason is that the prepubescent voice, it's higher pitched, and it seems to be easier to pick up the melodies. And there's a giant emphasis, especially in the Syriac Orthodox and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, on the hymns. And in the Syriac Orthodox Church, you have Saint Ephrem the Syrian, who, if I'm not mistaken, is a pre-schism doctor of the church in the Catholic Church. And in our church, he's got a very high place. And then in Ethiopia, his name is Saint Yared, or you could say Saint Jared the Aksumite. And these two figures of Saint Jared the Aksumite and Saint Ephrem the Syrian are seen as the chief hymnographers behind the Eucharistic and non-Eucharistic liturgies of the Syriac Orthodox and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And so there's this giant emphasis on singing. And so the thing, more than theology, more than doctrine, more than good moral formation and character. I have to say, sadly, if I'm being honest, de facto, the thing that people care about most is, can that boy sing?
Mm.
And that's really the main metric of entering the diaconate. And then they hope you become a good person over time. And if not, that you quit.
Dang, so I'm ready to become a deacon now.
Already, let's
They
go.
keep telling me I can sing.
You a singer, right?
Absolutely. I'm ready. I'm ready for service for the Lord.
Do they have an official position in the Catholic diaconate that you know of, like called cantor or chanter or anything like that?
No, for us, a cantor is just any person who sings at the mass. There's no
There's no
order
ordination. So a
associated.
lay person could do it. Anybody could do it.
Absolutely. And the deacon has no musical function in the liturgy.
Yeah, that's right. I hear more an administrative function. Is that right?
In a parish context, probably administrative, but in the liturgical function, there's assisting at the table during the Eucharist. They can preach or they can read the gospel. So being the lector for the gospel is certainly a part of their um, official ministry.
They hold it, or they read from it as well.
They read it, yeah.
Wow.
So you have to be ordained in order to read the gospel in a Catholic mass, either a deacon or a priest or a bishop.
I think the Coptic Orthodox allowed the deacon, I think either the subdeacon or the full deacon, to read from the gospel, if I'm not mistaken. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's reserved for the priest.
Fascinating. It's one of the many ways traditions diverge over the centuries.
That's right. And it's obviously like, this is the thing people struggle with, is like, I think categorizing certain things, and that's clearly not dogma, right? Like, we don't hold to, or we shouldn't hold to that the way that we cling to the resurrection of Christ, but some people might, and then that's where fights start, and that's where people open up their own denomination.
Indeed, unfortunately. And oh yeah, the deacon also, Catholic deacons also can preach the homily. So again, you have to be ordained to read the gospel and preach or preach a homily.
We don't have a hard and fast rule about that, but almost always that's the case. Typically, it wouldn't be a deacon unless he's in his 20s and 30s, as assigned. It's like duties as assigned. As assigned, he can be told to preach. And often in diaspora, the way that works in the West is that the churches are a little bit of ethnic enclaves, and so most of the church is done in Amharic, and so I don't know if any of the early Catholic churches were like that because they kind of had Latin as a common lingua franca, but I don't know if there were just no homilies or what language people did homilies in. But we would do homilies a lot of times in Amharic. But then if the homily is going to be in English, they might more likely get a younger deacon who grew up in the West to give that homily. And it's in that context that sometimes I am asked to do homilies, although sometimes I prefer to just do a kind of catechism outside in a classroom rather than from the pulpit. But there have been many times where I've asked and complied with giving a kind of either like a second mini homily or the sole homily on a Sunday.
Interesting. How, well, actually, I just want to ask about how the Ethiopian Rite liturgy works. Most of our readers will have never attended one and don't know anything about that. So we know you guys have 3 readings like us. Well, I'm assuming you have 3 readings like us. But beyond that,
Let me go through the
don't know what
readings.
happened.
I think it's more than that, and as I understand it, I think it's a Vatican II thing. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, where you guys added more Old Testament readings. But we start off with we go from lowest rank to highest rank, and canonically we have 4 positions, 2 deacons and 2 priests that do readings, and then there's a third deacon who's just like a helper, like a carrier of all the holy objects, which sounds like how you describe the deacon in the Roman tradition. But you have the associate deacon who reads from the Catholic epistles or the universal epistles, the non-Pauline epistles, the James or / Jacob, the John, and the Peter, or the Cephas. And then you have the number 1 deacon, or the primary deacon, who will read from the Pauline letters, any of the Pauline letters, and then the associate priest will read from the Acts of the Apostles, and then the primary deacon will come back, and as a way to lead up to the gospel, will read a psalm that the church connects to the gospel, and he'll chant that psalm, and there will be a back and forth with the people, whereas all the other readings are just read monotone. And then the main priest will come, and the main priest will read the gospel. And all of that is kind of considered the liturgy of the word, and it's kind of preceded by a lot of Trinitarian worship. But there are also like many segments which are found, I think, in like the writings of Hippolytus of Rome. And so I see this part of the liturgy is exactly like verbatim the same as the Catholic Church. The let us give thanks to God. It is right. It is just, peace be with you all and with your spirit. I found out recently, because I used to hear people say, and also with you, the end with your spirit is more faithful to the Latin and Italian and other languages. It also matches the Ge'ez. The end also with you, with some older Catholics got used to, was, I know you're a big fan of dynamic translations. It was like a dynamic translation. And over time, people got frustrated with the dynamism, and they said, let's be a little more literal to the Latin and the Italian and the Ge'ez, actually, in this case.
Oh,
and so we also say
literal.
in Ge'ez, and with your spirit. Yeah, word for word, whatever.
Yeah, not clarity notwithstanding, but that's none of my business.
Had you ever heard of and also with you? Had you heard that from anyone? I know you're a newer Catholic.
I'm aware of it, but yeah, that change was well before I converted. And I probably would prefer it because "and with your spirit" doesn't actually mean anything to the average English speaker.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think the "and also with you" has been in English so long. If I'm not mistaken, I would take a strong educated guess, I could be wrong, that it's what influenced like the Star Wars. May the Force be with you and also with you.
Oh Lord.
I would put a strong bet on, like, people underestimate the Catholic Church influence. Like, people in sports should know the Hail Mary, right? How many people say Hail Mary not knowing what, like, just thinking about the football pass?
Yeah. They say hocus pocus is a corruption of the Latin words used during the consecration.
That's right. That's right. So it's a great segue, because after the gospel is read, it's considered the halfway point of the liturgy. So the liturgy of the word is over, and then you have like the constitution or institution time. And so the bell is rung. We have an a cappella Eucharistic liturgy, but there are several moments of like import in the beginning, in the middle, and so on, and right before communion, to signify a change where a bell is rung. And it's not really like to be a musical instrument. It's kind of like Salah in the Psalms. It's like a pause. And so after the gospel is read, you get the bell rung, which is kind of a musical pause. Whereas normally it's the liturgy is constant. It's like there's no dead space. It's constantly people singing and chanting. And the first or the primary deacon says, "Depart, catechumens."
Mm.
And again, de facto and historically, the catechumens and or anyone who is not baptized and who is not receiving communion should leave at that time. So it's really weird, and a lot of weird taboos are broken in this digital age where people are live streaming on TikTok and Facebook, like the Eucharist. Like, there's a little bit of Christianity, which is supposed to be a mystery cult. And there's a little bit of that's too much. But at that point, on paper, catechumens are supposed to depart. And there are a lot of people who don't take communion today, even though they're not catechumens, for feelings of worthiness and other strange things, lack of trust, or lack of desire to stop sinning, but still God-fearing enough to show up to church.
Lord,
So so they just, a lot of people in the Ethiopian tradition who don't take communion, but they don't leave. So it's kind of this, like, again, weird clash, contradiction, tension, where the deacon is yelling at people, but it's in a musical melody, so it sounds nice, but he's saying, "Get out of here," he's saying, "Depart, catechumens." He goes, oh, no, sacristia, which is "Depart, catechumens, get out of here."
Hold on. I thought you told us you couldn't sing, because that sounded good.
I can't sing. There are other people who could sing. I can't sing, but that's a sample. And so he tells them to leave, but nobody leaves. They just look at him. and then the show goes on, and at that
Hold on,
point,
time out. If there actually are catechumens, do they leave?
no, they don't. They don't leave either. There are catechumens, so they don't leave either. Nobody leaves. It's why it's weird, but it's what the book says. The book says
Yeah,
leave,
I
and so they
remember
say that.
when I was briefly attending Byzantine churches, they say the same thing.
Yeah, my wife grew up for about a decade in the Greek Church of Antioch, which was in Riverside, California, and they have a lot of even convert priests and a ton of converts. So it's not just Cradle Orthodox, and they have Cradle Orthodox of Middle Eastern and Slavic persuasion in that community as well. But they have, I think, almost half the church is like a convert, and so they do a lot of things by the book, which is funny that sometimes converts do things by the book more than cradles do. But she tells me that they did leave there in the Greek Orthodox Church of
Lord.
Antioch. They would leave, and but the point of it is not just like you're kicking them out. The point of it is that at that time there should be a catechist who is catechizing them or teaching them the fundamentals of the faith outside to get them ready and prepared for their journey to being baptized so that they can take communion.
Yeah.
Like that's the whole like purpose of it, but it's not functioning in the Ethiopian church today, but we say it. We say depart catechumens. We say it every Eucharistic liturgy, and nobody's departing. And after that begins the second part of the Qaddasie, or the second part of I should say our word for liturgy is Qaddasie, which is related to the Hebrew Kadesh, or holy. And so it's like the hallowing process, like the Catholic Hallow app, or the sanctification process. It could also be considered a translation for Thanksgiving. The second part of the liturgy we call the Akotet Qurban. Akotet is a transliteration of the Greek Eucharist, and Qurban is common in Syriac languages as well as Arabic and Amharic and Ge'ez, the Semitic languages. Qurban means sacrifice, and so it's Thanksgiving sacrifice, or the Eucharistic sacrifice. And so every prayer after the depart catechumens is dedicated to the Eucharist and focused on the Eucharist, and focused on the kind of story of Maundy Thursday, and retelling the Last Supper, and sucking people into that narrative, into that story, and into that world, and inviting them to eat and drink at the table of the Lord, to eat his flesh and to drink his blood. And in that context, we have what are called anaphoras. And so we have 14 different mass styles, or anaphoras, that from that point, depending on the occasion, for the Lord, for the apostles, for Mary, for John Chrysostom, for Jacob of Sarug, who's a Syriac saint, like for all these different saints, for Epiphanius, for the Gregories, we have different anaphoras, and that's kind of what the liturgy looks like. And at the conclusion of that, people commune, and historically there should have been a homily when the gospel is read. Instead, often because people come late nowadays, they'll put the homily after communion to give people time to come, because our liturgy, and we're strict about this, begins at 6 a.m. and people are typically receiving communion around 9 a.m. And so if you went by a normal time, the homily would be sometime between like 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. because a lot of people aren't even at church at that time yet. They postpone the homily till after communion. So sometime after 9 o'clock, maybe 9:30 or 10 a.m., depending on the parish that you're at.
Maybe African American churches should consider this shift in the in the arrangement.
Is there a strict or loose interpretation about where to place the homily?
It's strict. So strict if you're doing it licitly, the way that you're supposed to do it. It'll be right after the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
But as I've recently learned, if you want to have someone preach the or a homily who is not licitly allowed to preach the homily, you can have a homily after the gospel or not, and then have a layperson, for example, preach after communion, which technically is not a homily. But, if you want to have a layperson speak, that's technically how you can do it, I think.
That's very interesting. I went to this church, which is under the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, and my Hebrew teachers go to that church. It's called St. Elizabeth's in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so before communion, they had a kind of 10-minute talk about communion, which is kind of like a homily. and then during the gospel they had a homily, and then after the liturgy was closed, during the coffee and tea hour, they allowed parishioners to preach during that time. Whereas the other time it was either an ordained person or somebody who is a graduate of one of the approved theological colleges or seminaries.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there was one gentleman, he is a PhD in Hebrew as well as a master's from an approved Orthodox theological college, although he was a layman. And so he was kind of wearing a cassock and allowed to preach during times where other lay people wouldn't. But during the coffee tea hour, any lay person, yeah, and they were encouraged to at that parish.
That's cool, because at least you find some way to get, lay insight. So after, well, first I want to clarify something. So the liturgy that people attend is only one part of the actual larger liturgy in the Ethiopian church, right?
That's correct. So that's the Eucharistic liturgy called the Qadasi, as I said. There are two other traditions of non-Eucharistic liturgy. The one is called Sa'atat, and it literally means hours. So it's the liturgy of hours or the breviary. Mm-hmm. And that tradition is very universal, I would say, and very similar to what you'd find in the Roman or the Latin tradition, the Greek tradition, and the Syriac tradition. Everybody has like a breviary or a liturgy of hours, right? It's universal in historic Christendom, in the apostolic churches. That's probably the oldest rite that we have outside the Eucharistic liturgy of what is done like extra. And the idea of that is that at the minimum, there are like canonical hours. Like Muslims are told to pray 5 times a day. Christians are told to pray 7 times a day. 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., 6 p.m., 9 p.m., and midnight. Sorry to Dr. Matthew Walker and other sleep doctors, only gives you 6 hours to sleep. Unless you're waking up at midnight, right? So that's very common throughout all of the historic apostolic churches in Christendom. So we have that's called Sa'atat, or the liturgy of hours. Sometimes simultaneously to that, which could come off as hectic or beautiful, depending on your point of view, or in place of that, there's something that we call Mahalet, which is like a spiritual song. Think the Song of Songs, and it borrows a lot of imagery from the Song of Songs as well as the Psalms. And that's what I think a lot of people online, especially some of the tradcaths, get upset about and get confused, because the liturgy of hours is a cappella, just like the Eucharistic liturgy. But this other thing is where our African side comes out, is African Christianity. And we have the kettle drum, right? There's a hand drum that we beat with on two sides, one larger than the other. Something called the sistrum or the sistra, which is this ancient device, which you see in ancient Israelite culture, in ancient Egyptian culture, and even the Minoan culture, which was the ancient pre-Bronze Age collapse civilization that was on the island of Crete, the Greek island, right? So in those ancient civilizations, you see this very ancient tool. It kind of goes, it's called the sistrum or the sistra. And then we have these walking sticks. So we have a walking stick, a sistrum, and a drum. And then we have singers who are creating choreography with these ancient instruments, the walking stick, the sistrum, and the drum. And they're all kind of collaborating and swaying back and forth. And it begins very solemnly and very slowly. But at the end of it, it gets like so full with ecstasy that people begin to say, "Oh my God, are these Orthodox or are these Pentecostals?" Because they start spinning the drum around, they're beating the drum, and then you hear the ululation of the women going alongside these Africans hitting drums and shaking the sistra and waving the giant walking stick. That is called the Mahalet, and it's its own separate tradition that is like the liturgy of hours, but it's really like a unique construct of the church in Ethiopia that doesn't exist in even the churches in communion with us in Egypt or Syria. And so that Sa'atat, or the Liturgy of Hours, would be normally any Sunday at 2 a.m. and on special occasions from midnight until the Eucharistic Liturgy at 6 a.m. And then worship of the Eucharistic Liturgy would continue from 6 a.m. to about 9 to 10 a.m. With the Mahalet, which is all the instrumental worship, you could begin at maybe 6, 7, or 8 p.m. the evening before, and you go till the Eucharist at 6 a.m. And there usually shifts. It's usually not the same person doing that, but you'll have you'll have consistent, unadulterated worship for about 12 to 15 hours in a parish, and that is done a minimum of 3 times every month in every church that has the capacity in Ethiopia. In the great city of Gondar, which I personally believe J.R.R. Tolkien, the great Catholic writer, took the name of the city to name one of his human cities in Lord of the Rings, and it's where my grandfather is from. There are so many active parishes that if you were a parishioner or a clergy and you wanted to celebrate this form of non-Eucharistic liturgy that goes from, at minimum, 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. and then goes into the Eucharistic liturgy from 6 a.m. to 9 to 10 a.m., you could do that close to 30 days a month. At minimum 20 days, you can do that. And some people do. Some people spend their life worshiping God in that way, like up to 20 times or more a month in the city of Gondar, Ethiopia.
So they're going straight to heaven when they die. They trying.
Hopefully they're too tired to sin.
I was about to say, they ain't got no time. That's beautiful, though. It makes me think of Anna in the Gospel of Luke, who says is in the temple praising God, praying all the time. And to our minds, it's like, how could anybody do that? But it's like, actually, in the motherland, apparently they're doing exactly that.
It's easier, I would say, in community than as an individual. And when there's already an established, like, you've seen people do it. At one point in my life, I moved to North Dakota and I said, wow, this is really cold, but there are human beings living here. And so if they could live here, I can too. And I think it's that way. If you see people doing it, it becomes more tangible than when you just sort of like pontificate about it from far away. And I thought it was crazy the first time. I didn't do that as a kid. I started doing that in my 20s, and I'm in my 30s now. And so when I started doing it in my 20s, I thought it was crazy, but you start doing it more and more, you feel it. And I've never done the full thing in that way. In the diaspora, in the diaspora, when I first started, people were starting at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. I've now seen certain people beginning at midnight or 1 a.m. And I know at least I have about 4 to 5 young friends in their early 20s who I know personally have begun at 10 or 11 p.m. the night before. And that means they go through. And some of them, just being honest, they'll knock out by the time the Eucharistic liturgy gets there. Because at that point, they've been worshiping for like 6-7 hours. And it's not just standing still. Like, you're yelling, you're shouting the hymns of the church during that time. And you're active, you're moving, you're hitting the drum, you're swaying. You might be sweating depending on where in the U.S. you are.
Hey, God is worthy of all the praise, right?
Amen.
That's incredible. I just wanted to ask about that because I remember you telling me liturgy starts at some ungodly hour for some of the people. I was like,
Yeah, the requirement and the ask is 6 a.m. every Sunday, and people still don't follow that. You know, I hear in your tradition that's called a mortal sin. We don't use that language, but we definitely pressure them.
Yeah, I think deep down, every tradition has some idea of things you just absolutely should not be doing, and I think skipping church is probably one of them, without good reason anyway, which is how we get around it in our tradition. You know, do we have a grave reason? Okay. But yeah, a lot of people just ain't going to church. It's cool though. We'll rope them back in one way or another. Well, thank you for explaining the Ethiopian liturgy. I think that's fascinating. I've never been to more than just the regular Sunday service, but that was enough to open my eyes, because I was still Protestant when I first came. Open my eyes to a larger tradition beyond what was then my Protestant background. So
You were there for my wedding too, so that was a full liturgy plus
I
plus
was.
the matrimonial service, which would have extended about 30, 40 minutes.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I remember I first came there for a project though, for my
Hmm. You outlasted that boy, Professor Kendrick.
as I should. No. Shout out to Dr. Kenny. But yeah, I'm really appreciative for the Ethiopian liturgy and yeah, just preserving such a beautiful tradition that honestly, in my opinion, has something to teach uh, all churches of the African diaspora about the spiritual heritage of the motherland. That's kind of how I see it. You know, the worship that you guys have been doing for thousands of years, I think, helps inform what Christianity can and should look like in certain communities today. Because so many Christians think, you know, there shouldn't be drums. Churches shouldn't use drums. Christians shouldn't be dancing in church, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, actually one of the oldest churches in existence. Maybe not in the Eucharistic liturgy, but in their spirituality. This is, you know, part and parcel to what they do. So to me, that's, you know, really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's a really smart insight you said is that, and I try to differentiate that for some people online, and some get it, some don't, you know, leave the rest to the Lord, is it seems that people are most touchy about the Eucharist and the things around it in the conversations of what you're talking about, like what exactly is reverence? And is this Christian reverence, or is this European reverence imported to the Americas? What is African reverence? What is Asian reverence? And even those things themselves, it's not like Africa, Europe, and Asia are monoliths. There's so many cultures within that how can you think about reverence in different ways? And so maybe there's a place outside of the Eucharist in like a, I don't know, a gathering on a Monday night or something else where there could be more experimentation. I'll give you an example of that is even we might seem open and flexible to you in that regard because of our drum usage. But the Coptic Orthodox churches, of course, as I said, are our mother church in many ways because we got bishops from them for centuries. They have this thing now where outside of, never in the Eucharist, but outside of the Eucharistic liturgy, they'll gather on like a Monday night, Wednesday night, or Thursday night, and they'll sing songs with a guitar. Now, sometimes they're singing that CCM, that Christian contemporary music, and they shouldn't be. But some, yes, it's surprising. But often they're translating their own hymns, and sometimes they put a little acoustic guitar behind that. If you try to do that in an Ethiopian community, you might get stoned to death. You know, like that's how they feel because they're open to the drum because it's like African and they know it, but they don't know the guitar. And for them, the only people they know that use the guitar are the Pentecostals. And so they have this like suspicion for any other type of instrument. There were some parishes for a time, even under the king, a man who later was his spiritual advisor and later became the Archbishop of California. He became well known because the parishes under him, there were three, and they were all in the West Coast. He was in Oakland, so there was one in Oakland. There were two in LA, and there was one in Seattle, where I'm now based. And they all had pianos. Now, none of the pianos or the organs were used during the Eucharistic liturgy. They were all for sort of these modern hymns, which are sung outside of the context of the Eucharistic liturgy. But that piano and that organ used to drive people crazy. And it gotten to the point now where most people have just gotten rid of them. But, you know, there's nothing like dogmatically or doctrinally wrong. It's just like people's aesthetic, you know, values of reverence, like you're talking about. So we deal with that too, is something I just wanted to share with you.
That's fascinating. And that's part of why I think American Catholics are so opposed to certain things is because they associate them with Protestantism. And so they can't imagine that such a thing could be integrated into Catholic worship. Whereas the African Americans, of course, many of them are converts from Protestantism and may bring parts of that tradition with them. And even people who aren't converts, that's just kind of part of being a Black American in many cases, is that that's the music that you know. And
yeah, and I think it's good to be concerned, but we need to like be sober minded and measure each thing on its own. And the idea, I think it's the same idea about like the adoption of pagan holidays. The question in each case should be, whatever this thing used to be, has it been successfully baptized or christened or chrismated into Christianity? And so I'll give you two examples and we can move on, or if you have other examples, we could hear it. The one we have to begin with is the cross itself. And this is like the big one everyone just like runs by. The cross was not a Christian symbol. The cross was the symbol of the Roman Empire, used to inspire death and the fear of death, and to instill that into people as a form of punishment. If you don't obey us, this is what happens to you. And so that symbol was wholly like Roman, and we have to say, what was the Roman religion? It was pagan, right? That symbol was transformed by Jesus Christ, so that today people don't even really think about it in its Roman context outside of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So that symbol, I think nobody can argue, has been perfectly transformed. Now, I have in my day, by the way, encountered some people who argue even about that symbol. They'll say, oh, he rose, so don't wear his body on the little cross, or da, da, da. So I have met some people, but I think that symbol has been successfully transformed, and most reasonable minds would agree. The second one I give you is from our tradition. The Coptic Orthodox Church, I find to be incredible, because a lot of people in our communion are like the pagans from scripture who submitted to Yahweh. And so the Copts are the children of Pharaoh. And they have two things that they do. One, they have something in their liturgy of hours called the midnight praises from the Tasbih, I think, on Saturday nights. This is the liturgy before the liturgy, right? So they praise every Saturday night in preparation for Sunday morning. And in the middle of their midnight praises, they sing from Exodus 15, and they praise the God who buried Pharaoh and his chariots in the Red Sea. And I'm like, whoa, these Egyptians saying that. Can you imagine? Can you imagine any other group of people praising God for having buried their leader in the Red Sea, right? So that's like that tool of Pharaoh transformed for God's glory in the Egyptian people. The same church, the Coptic Orthodox Church, on Good Friday, they have this song called Golgotha, which they use in this ritual where they like rebury Christ, where they think about the burial tomb of Christ. In the hymns associated with Golgotha, if you listen to it in the Coptic or in the English, that melody is the tune that used to be used to bury the pharaohs. So they kept the melody the same, but they brought Christian lyrics to it. And so I think when you look at like the cross, when you look at the Coptic Orthodox tradition, if you can take pagan tools and transform them into Orthodox Christian tools, can a Catholic take a Protestant tool? I don't know. Some people just might think it's totally tainted, but can we be creative enough to make it Catholic, to make it Orthodox, whatever the case may be?
It's funny because for the African Americans, it's not even a secular thing necessarily that needs to be baptized. They're saying, well, that's not Christian enough, because we're talking about like gospel music. It's like this was born from a very Christian tradition, but for some people, that's not good enough. So yeah, it's interesting. I can see why people would be uncomfortable with it, but at the same time, for the people who actually live in that tradition, that patrimony, it makes perfect sense to them. They're like, why wouldn't we use our musical tradition to worship God, especially when that tradition is already in itself Christian? But so it goes. Controversies will never end in the church, I believe.
Not this side of Judgment Day.
No, it's just how it is. Switching gears a little bit. I don't want to keep you forever. I want to talk about what I'm calling your education ministry, because I know outside of the liturgy in your church, you teach Amharic, I believe, and you generally are an educator. So tell me about how you are inspiring fidelity to your tradition with your private education practices.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was good to use a broad term like education. And before me, my mother was an educator. On my dad's side, one of his sisters is an educator. And both of my mom's parents were educators as well. Her father went from being a teacher to later being a school administrator and then other positions of power. So I do have a long history of it. And actually, even on my dad's side, my dad's a businessman, but his father was a deacon, and a lot of his family from his mother and his father's side were clergy. You could say that the clergy is kind of like an education position as well by default, almost. Whether or not people fulfill that vocation is up to them. But yeah, I could say from the earliest days when you and I knew each other, my first job out, let me say college first. In college, I interned under the Honorable Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Democrat from Ohio, who was redistricted. And my experience in the belly of the beast, not in Ohio, but in Washington, D.C., was that I didn't like how the sausage was made. And so I began to think about how can I affect change in the world, which is the thing that many college educated people intend to do. Now the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so I think the issue is that a lot of people shoot for the moon in what they try to control and change. And I think that's what I saw in the ugliness of compromise, even in the house of Dennis Kucinich, who, if anyone remembers, was one of the most uncompromising of the Democrats. And even there were a couple of times where I did see compromise, and I saw it in other traditions. Not to badmouth him, he's fantastic, and I had a great time in his office. It was an office of 7, so I got to see him very often, and I was his legislative intern at that time. But I knew I didn't want to work in that capacity, even though I had studied political science. And so I said, how can I affect a kind of political change on a hyper-local level? And I said, you know what? Maybe it's just teaching. So I signed up for AmeriCorps, which some people, by the way, have advocated making compulsory. I never think that would be good, but it's interesting whenever people have arguments about suffrage, maybe tying it to suffrage would be something interesting. And maybe that would get more people out of the communities they're in to see other communities. And so I grew up in North LA in relatively comfortable, privileged area of Van Nuys, California. I mean, at one point, it had the highest crime in Los Angeles, but it wasn't like murders. It was sort of like petty theft, like I didn't see a lot of shootings or murders growing up, but almost every house on my block was robbed. Like that was the kind of middle income, middle class area in the east side of the San Fernando Valley, generally the north side of LA, where I spent my most formative years, even though I was born in the west side of LA. And
West Side?
West LA, baby. And and I graduated college seeking to be close to that home, but in a different community. And so when I did randomly go to church, I did used to go to South Central a lot, but I never like lived there. It was kind of like a weekend venture. And I had family in the jungles off Martin Luther King and Crenshaw, and a family in Inglewood too. But again, it's always just me visiting there. I'm really from the valley, the San Fernando Valley, the famous one of the film industry. So my first job was working in Watts, or unincorporated South Los Angeles technically, but right next to the Watts Towers. And so it was in education, and it was as a para-educator tutoring some of the lowest scoring students in English and mathematics in all of Los Angeles in the elementary school by day. Inside of a classroom, I'd have my own 10 students, and it'd be a class of maybe 30 students. I'd take 10 of them, which then creates a ratio of 20-1 instead of 30-1 for the teacher. So the advantage for those 10 students is that I get to pour into them my recent, college education to help them with English and math. They get like those students who need it more get the ratio of 10-1 for an adult. And then the kind of credentialed licensed teacher gets a ratio of 20-1. This is one of the many experiments that happens in, South LA. It's full of educational experiences. And I did the best that I could that year, and I felt like I made an impact. In the afternoons, we had an after school program too, where we got to do our own stuff, and that was like more fun, creative type of education. In addition to all of that, I was passionate about where my family came from, and they always taught me my culture. They taught me how to speak. They didn't teach me how to read and write. I taught myself how to read and write in Amharic, and so I would occasionally have pop up sometimes in a vegan Ethiopian restaurant in South LA, um, sometimes online, sometimes in people's homes, kind of pop up short, like several week courses in Amharic. Sometimes I would help teach Amharic in the church. Sometimes I would do so on my YouTube programs as well. Or like I said, private lessons on Google Meet or Zoom throughout the years, and sometimes doing interpreter jobs for low-income housing, for hospitals, and very rarely in court, or actually even in immigration offices for people seeking asylum and related citizenship status changes. So I've used those kind of educational roles to do that. And I went off for a time to be an organizational ombudsman. Didn't like the politics in some of the university settings. I was working in higher education. So I said I would, in 2019, I said I'd return to K to 12 education. And so I graduated 2012, did all these other things in between, returned to K to 12, and consistently from 2019 till now to 2025, I've been teaching K to 12. And I started doing kind of district and charter schools, but then I started moving to independent schools. I had an experience with an Episcopal school, and now I'm on my second Catholic school. The first one was through a connection that was randomly when you were visiting Los Angeles, right? I can say a little bit about that. That was the beautiful Transfig, which was a Black Catholic school in LA. And then I moved on to another Jesuit network, actually, that I'm teaching at now at the high school level. The other one was at the middle school level, 5th through 8th grade. So I'm in my second Catholic school, and I've done Episcopal schools, I've done charter schools, I've done independent schools, and then I've done YouTube stuff, I've done church stuff. So yeah, those are the different facets of education. What I really like to do on my own now is I had over 150 episodes on my podcast called The Philosophy of Art and Science, which is very educational about the church and things like that. And I'm still open to doing episodes there, but I've also thought of like potentially stopping that and focusing on book reviews in the kind of vein of the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books. I've titled mine the Aksum Review of Books. The Aksum is the historical name, of Ethiopia. And so for me, a lot of my identity is both Ethiopian and American. And so anything tangentially related to Ethiopian studies or American studies, if it's literature, either old literature in the public domain that I'm reviving, or that's in a different language like Italian or Spanish or Amharic that I'm translating and editing, or my grandfather's has a memoir that I'm doing from Amharic into Amharic again, or Amharic into English, or just book reviews on great books of the Orthodox Church and other things. Those are my kind of education projects.
Man, you are spanning the spectrum, to say the least.
Yeah, and I'd say one of our common links, although my video audio failed on me that day, the technology didn't help us, is, for example, the figure of Father Amditz Ion Hamilton of the Watts Prophets and of the First Ethiopian Orthodox Parish in LA, where you did a fantastic written interview with him. I got a recorded poem out of him where I had him on my phone on Facebook, Facebook chat, and then I stuck that next to my mic to try to record it. And so we got a poem together that he did for my channel, because the technology failed us on the video chat. But him and I spoke a couple times for over an hour, and that those conversations are kept in our hearts, but lost technologically.
Sometimes the Lord said, "This one can't get out. No one gets to hear this one." But yeah, Father Amdi is he's fascinating. I will just say that. Shout out to the Watts Prophets. I like to say as he likes to say, they basically invented rap, which is crazy. Like, you need to
Invented
tell me.
rap on the West Coast, was in prison for drugs, was a part of the Watts riots in the 1960s, was a part of the Jewish Hollywood project of the Watts Writing Workshop, which later also produced one Nipsey Hussle, who is a member of both the African American community and the Eritrean Orthodox community in communion with me. And of course, I did his funeral back in 2019. God rest his soul. Jeremiah is his given name, or Hermias. And and then he met the figure of former Abba, or Father Mandefro, who became Bishop Isaac, who was an emissary of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, who sent this mission to the African diaspora in the Caribbean and North America to present an African flavor of Christianity, to remind them that unlike the NOI people like Louis Farrakhan and Elijah Muhammad, he would say Christianity is not the white man's religion, but it's a universal religion, and this is how we've expressed it in Africa for over a millennium. And so Father Amda Hamilton was brought into the church from Rastafarianism, which he kind of was into from prison books he was reading, kind of similar to the story of Malcolm X. And then, Bishop Isaac, who was sent by the emperor to show you how church and state were one in the milieu of my parents. He started the first church in LA, and he served there throughout the 70s and 80s. And he's a retired priest now, so he's a priest emeritus, but it's always cool to see him online. He had a new series of videos he was shooting on Instagram not too long ago. I think his son's been helping him out. He's in his 80s. So
he's not a retired rapper poet. He's still doing that.
He's still
but
doing
you forgot
that.
To mention that he started out as a Black Catholic. We can't leave that part out.
He did. And you forgot to mention Creole.
Exactly. Creole. Shout out to the Creoles. He's probably Pope Leo's cousin, not confirmed. I'm just
hey, that would be funny. Yeah, Henry. I don't know if I had sent it to you, but Henry Louis Gates just did the research for Pope Leo and handed it to him.
Yes. Hopefully he will acknowledge it publicly at some point.
Instead of just people speculating.
Right. Like, come on, Your Holiness. We need you to speak on it. Just speak on it. One good sentence saying, yes, this is true. Like, just for me. Pope Leo, if you hear this, we waiting on you.
But he was a part of, he told me, which never got recorded, one of the first 26 Black families in Los Angeles. It originally had come from Texas and Louisiana, from the Creole people who were Black Catholic. The Black Catholic Church he grew up in Los Angeles is today called Holy Cross, and it's actually a Hispanic parish. Funny enough, it's right next to my home parish called Virgin Mary's Ethiopian Orthodox Church, deep in South Central, in the late 40s up to 50th Street on and Main Street as the intersection in South LA. But yeah, that's the church Father Amda grew up at, and it transitioned as a lot of South LA did. And people comment a lot about that. He has a lot of thoughts about that too. But this pushing out via prices, but also via violence of African American peoples from this area, and a lot of Hispanics moving in, and then new services being done. And that's interesting because he said when he was a child, his grandmother didn't even speak English. She spoke Creole to him, and that he wasn't fluent in Creole, but he knew how to respond to her in English. And I think that early experience helped him connect with a lot of Ethiopians, because it's almost as if you're an immigrant. Like, it's weird because he has this deep African American heritage in the US, but because it's Creole, it's almost as if he was an immigrant in his experience.
Yeah. Back then, that's interesting because when you first said it, I was like, really? She would have spoke Louisiana Creole? But yeah, that his grandma would be from the 1800s, early 1800s probably. So yeah, that makes sense. But his story that he shared with me, I'll never forget. I'm glad that it turned into an interview, so I won't recount it all here. But yeah, he's incredible. And that parish, Holy Cross, I think is affiliated with one of the big Catholic cemeteries. So even though the parish is no longer African American. A lot of the African American Catholics from early Los Angeles history and later are buried there nearby at the
I
morgue.
never made that connection. So Slauson Avenue, which is the famous, was made famous by Nipsey Hussle, is 10 blocks south of 50th, about where Holy Cross the church is. But that's on Main. For people who know LA, like shout out to our homie Caleb, he would always call the
Yeah.
East Siders. If you're over there, that's the East Side, right? But if you go west of the 110 freeway on Slauson Avenue, and you go all the way west till you're in what Frank Ocean calls the Black Beverly Hills, Ladera Heights, you have Holy Cross Cemetery, which is what you mentioned. And I had never connected the two. I thought it was just a common name. But
It
at
might
that
be,
cemetery,
but I think they're affiliated.
okay, that would be amazing because there's another Ethiopian parish that's right next to there on Slauson and Shenandoah, or Slauson and La Cienega. And that one's called St. Mary's, whereas mine is Virgin Mary's, very similar name. And so people from the Virgin Mary's and the St. Mary's Church are often buried. Like I know people in my family and others who are buried at that very same cemetery. And so we talked about this baptism of blood earlier. There's another baptism in death if we're sharing a space.
Indeed. I'm just curious because I would have thought, I mean, I think normally you can't be buried in a Catholic cemetery unless you're Catholic, but I know there are exceptions that are made.
I believe our money is Catholic.
No comment. No comment. Um, Man, okay, so I don't actually have any more questions, but if there's something else you want to share with the good people of the BCM listening community, I'm all ears.
Yeah, all I would like to share is come and experience the Ethiopian Orthodox Church wherever you may be. We have a fully English parish called SPOT, which stands for St. Paul Orthodox Tewahedo in the Washington, D.C. area. Although a lot of parishes don't have a ton of English services, they'll usually have somebody hopefully speaking English that could explain some things that, like our brother Nathaniel did when he was, exploring different traditions. I would say just visit. It doesn't mean you have to convert, but just experience and see what it's like. There are things unique to us, which we mentioned, like singing. What I didn't mention is we take our shoes off and we attribute it to scriptural passages, like Moses being told to take his shoes off before the holy bush, burning bush. Joshua, if you remember, appears before one of the chief angels of the Lord and is also told, like Moses, to take his shoes off. He's standing on holy ground. So we have kind of reasons behind it and unique things. We wear these white shawls. There are unique things, but I'd say visit us, check us out. And if I may, I would plug again on YouTube, The Philosophy of Art and Science, and on Substack, aksum.substack.com, to check out various book reviews I do. And you might be interested in any of the literature about the tradition. If you're never going to visit a parish, at least you could read about it or see it online.
And I'm going to personally plug one of my favorite musical groups, the Young Orthodox Tewahedo Christians. They have an album, 2 albums, I think now, but yeah, I think it's called, let me look it up.
Yeah, YOTC, the group you mentioned, that's the group that became the Spot Parish. So they started as a youth group at multiple parishes, and when they got their stuff together enough, they became a parish in DC. Chocolate City, as it used to be called.
My former place of residence. Yeah, everybody check out their album called Nation of the Cross from 2018. And I think they released another one a few years ago. It's not on streaming. It's not on YouTube Music, that is. You might be able to find it somewhere else. But
I think it's on Apple and Spotify. Them, and there's another group called Ahadu Studios, and there's a lot of crossover work between them, do a lot of English spiritual songs.
Let me look that up because I do listen to this. But anyways, thank you, Deacon Enoch, for joining us today. The Black Catholic Messenger Show is much indebted to your wisdom, to your ministry, and yeah, thank you for coming on the show and spreading your wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning in to the Black Catholic Messenger Show, where we keep it black and we keep it Catholic. Black Catholic Messenger is an independent, nonprofit media organization covering stories of interest to African American Catholics. If you like what you've heard on the show, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite platform, and please do visit us at blackcatholicmessenger.org to read our stories and make a donation. Thank you.